Greetings, all. What a wonderful conversation you had about cultural humility. Um, I wish every group of social workers could be this savvy and insightful. Joanne provides a great framing of cultural humility. You say true cultural humility stems from the understanding that none of us perceives the world in quite the same way. Whenever we treat others as an extension of ourselves, or perhaps even worse, we treat others as a static collection of assumptions, we're being culturally arrogant. And as you also say, unfortunately, we tend to live more in our heads, not in our hearts. It feels, quote, safer to have someone figured out than it does to just be open to whatever arises. We actually are hardwired to categorize and judge. And this is an important point. Anthropological and neurological research does indicate that recognition and response to difference as threat is very common and originally served the purpose of self-preservation. So in a sense, we are hardwired to be to prefer those who are similar to us, and at the same time, that does not at all mean that we are hardwired to be prejudiced or discriminatory, because we also have the responsibility to be aware of our tendencies to undervalue people who are different. So cultural humility and humility in general, of course, are essential to effective practice. One critical point is that a power differential, particularly that inherent in a colonial relationship, inevitably colors a person's perspective about other people. As Amanda points out, I grew up being aware of other cultures' existence without ever truly understanding them or experiencing them in depth. This allowed me to form my own false sense of cultural competence that never really got challenged. The risk for anyone in a dominant cultural group is that it tends to happen that you confuse your perspective with the perspective, with what is normal and reasonable. And so it's very important to be aware that there is a added responsibility that goes with being in the dominant group, and that is the responsibility of being mindful and being self-aware. This is the reason that I think the idea of unconscious bias is problematic and somehow connotes a free pass for people in the dominant culture having a bias against other people, and there really is no such thing as a justification for a free pass. It is the responsibility of everyone to be aware of our biases and prejudices. So as you so well pointed out, real people don't fit into categories. There are more within group differences than there are between group differences. Categories, as you pointed out, are arbitrary and socially constructed. So you can see that only from a dominant culture perspective or a colonial mindset is it possible to imagine capturing all the relevant information in a limited time period. When you flip it and think in terms of understanding the dominant culture, members of a dominant culture would just think it was the height of folly if anybody attempted to understand everything about that culture after absorbing a few trainings or reading a few books. But somehow people in the dominant culture think that it's perfectly reasonable to do that with regard to other people. Sandy points out with regard to the reading that you can conceptualize cultural humility as a practice of challenging and recognizing the power imbalances and being committed to lifelong critical self-evaluation and learning, and holding institutions accountable to practices of cultural humility. You can see that cultural humility is very closely connected to mindfulness in that way. And as Jesse points out, cultural humility ties in well with the recovery model, because in the context of the recovery model, wellness is best defined by the individual. In general, humility, wouldn't you say, is a necessity in any authentic relationship. As Joanne points out, there are multifaceted factors related to worldview. As you say, our moment-to-moment existence and our experience of it is constantly impacted by thousands of different factors. And as Elizabeth points out, the idea of cultural humility being common sense, I think, is pretty far from reality, at least for me. Even though I'm aware of cultural humility and try to be in an open and honest space most of the time, I still find myself having to work hard to be humble when dealing with certain individuals and their cultural beliefs. When I encounter someone whose views go against mine at a fundamental level, it takes strength and work to treat them in a way that cultural humility and the principles of social work deem they should be treated. So, as you point out, just in the same way that mindfulness practice is called practice and requires continuous effort, the same is true of cultural humility. It's not a destination. It is a continuous challenge. And as Scott points out, the concept behind cultural humility appeals to me because it's more of a state of being rather than an objective to attain. More than anything, the shift from cultural competence to cultural humility enables me to let go of my assumptions and become a better listener, which is another way of saying and be more present and more authentic and more democratic in relationship. As several of you discussed, it's important to find a personal referent to facilitate perspective and cultural humility. Tori and Jamie have beautifully described what it felt like entering a community as an outsider, and those experiences can be such personal reference. And so, as you discussed so beautifully, cultural humility is a continuous challenge, and it's not a destination. It's not an attribute. And the more privilege one has, the more challenging it can be to accept the responsibility and act on that responsibility of being humble with regard to other people across demographic lines. So this was quite a wonderful conversation, and as usual, I appreciate the extent to which you have engaged with the material and one another. Well done.